I'd like to extend a warm greeting to all of our alumni, students, colleagues and friends watching from across the globe. My name is Craig Rutherford and I'm a Development Officer in our Development and Alumni team. If this is your first Saints Talk, then thank you for joining us. Our Saints Talks are short presentations by leading members of our academic community on key areas of our world-leading research. It's a little flavour of the expertise that our lucky students get to see on a daily basis. This evening's talk will be given by Dr. Mateja Peter from our School of International Relations. The talk will last for about 30 minutes and then Dr. Peter will be happy to field your questions. We'll aim to wrap up the event by 6:15 at the latest, so do please get your questions in early during the talk if you'd like to ask anything. If you'd like to ask a question, you can add that to the chat bar on your screen. Before we get into it, I'd just like to do a quick plug for the rest of the Saints Talk series. You can access the full archive of past talks on a plethora of subjects from artificial intelligence to marine mammal research on our dedicated St Andrews Alumni YouTube channel, where this talk will also be available over the coming days. This is the last Saints Talk of the academic year, but do please keep your eyes peeled for the next edition, which will be in September. Before that though, let's get back to this evening's topic at hand and tonight's guest. Dr. Mateja Peter is the Executive Director of the Scottish Council on Global Affairs and Senior Lecturer in our School of International Relations. Her research focuses on the role of third-party interveners, so states and international organisations, in contemporary peace processes and post-conflict reconstruction. Dr. Peter also acts as a research lead on the Peace Rep Global Fragmentation Project, funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. You'll hear more about that in a bit. In this talk, Dr. Peter will explore recent changes in approaches to managing violent conflicts and the increasing importance of transactionalism in contemporary peace processes. As the world becomes more fragmented, how is the peace field changing? Who are the new actors mediating conflicts? How are global powers, such as the US, Russia and China, approaching peace agreements and negotiations? What does this mean for some of the most pressing conflicts and their transitions to peace? Where does this leave traditional liberal peacemakers, such as the United Nations? And is there still space for progressive realism advanced by the UK government? So without further ado, I will hand you over to Mateja for this evening's talk.
Thank you very much, Craig. As you can see, we're taking on quite a lot today. So thanks to you for the invitation and to the rest of the development team for organizing this. And to all of you, of course, for joining us and giving me an opportunity to share some of the research we've been conducting on what I will say is, while it's an ongoing project, I'm sure it's a timely topic that will hopefully pique your interest as well. So before I go into sort of the actual sort of the topic, I just wanted to situate it a tiny bit. So the questions that kind of motivate my research, and Craig already flagged them up a tiny bit. I've always been interested in sort of transitions from war to peace. And I think it's a fascinating kind of area to kind of jump into and particularly explore how third parties are kind of thinking about these transition, in particular sort of about peaceful transition, not necessarily helping other countries militarily. So I've been exploring, my research has been exploring areas such as state building after conflicts, looking quite a lot at the Balkans, but also UN peacekeeping and sort of much more recently mediation, which I'll be talking about today. And in particularly, I'm interested in sort of norms and rules governing transitions and sort of how can we come to sort of these more collective approaches to solutions to violent conflicts. And so it won't come as a surprise that questions that I'm interested in are kind of at the intersection of sort of academic research and policy. And so before coming to St Andrews, I was actually working at research institutes in Washington, Berlin, and Oslo, which then made me, when I moved to St Andrews, kind of very heavily engaged also with the Scottish Council on Global Affairs, which is a think tank that St Andrews is currently chairing. But the project that I'll speak to you about today, and sort of try to kind of think through some of the questions that Craig was raising, is sort of this peacemaking in a fragmented world. It's a project, a research project that I'm heading as part of the Peace Rep Consortium, supported by the Official Development Assistance and Foreign Office. It's a very close collaboration with the University of Edinburgh Law School, and some of the findings that I'll talk to are kind of collaborative elements that I'm working on with colleagues there. But I'm also very fortunate to be working with a fantastic research group at St. Andrews. There's a couple of postdoctoral researchers, and we work quite closely with several PhD students who work with us as analysts. And from September on, we're embarking on a new adventure where we will be integrating St. Andrews undergraduates into our work, in particularly helping us construct one of the data sets that I'll be talking about today as underlying some of our findings. So the question that is kind of motivating our research is, how are geopolitical transformations impacting mediation and peace processes? And as part of that, we're constructing two data sets, and I'll talk about sort of findings from some of these data sets. Both of these are evolving data sets. So one is looking at actors in sort of legal peace agreements, and that's a project that's led by colleagues at University of Edinburgh. And then the second data set is the mediation data set. So we're looking at actors in mediation, which is a project that's headed by us, and will also be kind of featuring quite a lot in sort of my talk today. So I've kind of divided the talk into sort of 4 sections just to kind of flag it up. I'll spend most of the time speaking about sort of great powers and peacemaking, but I think it's important to situate sort of the newsline hitting discussions about sort of US approaches or Russian approaches or Chinese approaches into sort of broader discussions about transitions from war to peace, and then sort of what's happening kind of beyond great powers. So I'll start kind of situating us sort of in a contemporary moment and thinking and why sort of I'm even raising these questions about transition from war to peace. Great. So wars that end. So not all wars end, and we know quite a lot of wars that are continuing on for ages, but wars that end generally, just to help us kind of think through, end in 3 different ways. So they could either end in victory of one side or another. They could end in a negotiated settlement between the parties that are in conflict, or they could end in sort of what UCDP, so this is a different data set, calls low activity, which could mean sort of that intensity of war declines. It's a frozen conflict. There's a regrouping or actor splintering so that they lose it in their own data set. So the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I want to highlight sort of how transitions from war to peace are changing, and they're also changing very recently. So during the Cold War, and that's that first stack that you're seeing on your left, victory was the most common civil war ending. So most wars ended with one party or another winning a war, and that's kind of the orange stack. So about 55% of wars, civil wars during the Cold War, ended after one party defeated another. So this dramatically changed in the post-Cold War era, and sort of in the first 2 decades of the post-Cold War era, negotiated settlements start dominating, and they become the way of kind of terminating war. So the international community gets very heavily involved in finding solutions for conflict and sort of negotiating settlements. So that's the blue stack in the middle, and about 35% of all wars start ending in sort of negotiated settlements. So this seems to be changing over the last kind of 10, 15 years. The latest data that we have is from 2020, but negotiated settlements are on decline again. So you can see that the blue stack is going down, but conflicts are also not ending in victories anymore. So something is happening where the wars are just kind of becoming frozen and they're kind of splintering and they're just kind of continuing on to it. So, but the question that I am primarily interested in, so this kind of transition from war to peace, is why are negotiated settlements becoming more difficult? And so in my own thinking, there's kind of several interrelated reasons, and we have fantastic research on this. So on the one hand, conflicts are changing. So one of the main reasons why there's less negotiated settlements is because some of the actors that we're witnessing in wars now are prescribed actors. So for example, I'll give you a very good example of the conflict in Afghanistan, where it was very difficult to negotiate a settlement with the Taliban regime, which was a prescribed actors by a lot of the mediators. Or if you think of sort of Hamas today. So there's an increasing presence of prescribed actors which are much more difficult to bring into a negotiated settlement. The other thing that is also changing, that is an underlying condition that is changing, is we're seeing an increasing fragmentation of local actors, in particular rebel groups, which then ends up meaning that there's just so much more actors that need to be brought to a table in order to come to this negotiated settlement. So it's not just government versus one actor in a conflict. And then the third component, and this is the component of a conflict that is changing that I will speak about more today, is that wars are also increasingly getting internationalized. And I'm again kind of giving you sort of a little chart from UCDP PRIO Armed Conflict Data Set. So the muster, they think, the lines that are kind of on the increase since around 2010 are essentially showing the rise of internationalized wars. And they have a very strict definition of internationalized wars, which means that third parties are actively contributing combat personnel, so boots on the ground in it. So clearly internationalization of wars happens in other ways as well, which we'll be chatting about today as well. But in addition to sort of conflicts changing, so the underlying condition of why that settlements are more difficult, we're also seeing changed responses. And that's what I'm going to spend discussing today, and particularly focusing on the great powers, but also bringing us a bit more widely. And they're changing in kind of two ways that I'm going to try to highlight in my talk. One is that the multipolarity is leading to sort of a diversification of actors, and then that sort of the multipolarity is also leading to an increasing competition and congestion of actors, which is then leading to transactional approaches. Okay. So let's start with the great powers and how great powers engage in peacemaking. So I'll spend most of my time today talking about the United States and Russia, highlighting also China in sort of its approaches in peacemaking. And I'll put aside UK and France, but I'm obviously happy to take that in the questions as well. Okay, so first to what I'm going to say is provisionally good news. So US and Russia are very active peacemakers. And by peacemakers, I mean they're the biggest, some of the biggest third-party signatories to peace agreements. So they sign more peace agreements than other actors, primarily acting as kind of guarantors, sort of witnesses, sort of they monitor, they kind of provide security guarantees in a lot of these conflicts. So besides the United Nations, Russia and United States clearly top the chart of biggest third-party signatories of peace agreements. But there is some change over time, all right? And now I'll kind of give you a bigger graph of sort of how the all permanent 5 members are signing peace agreements over time. And you can see that most peace agreements were signed kind of in the 1990s. So this is the data that goes back to the 1990s. And this won't be surprising just because a lot of the peacemaking in the wars in the Balkans and Eastern Europe included a lot of agreements or a lot of partial agreements as well. And so for the kind of the first 2 decades, of the post-Cold War era, United States, and those are the Black Peats, was clearly the biggest signatory in sort of most peace settlements. But that seems to be changing a tiny bit over the last 15 years. And if you look at sort of the blue square highlighted sort of from 2010 on, Russia, which is the yellow line, is clearly surpassing the United States as a peace signatory. So is Russia now a peacemaker, or do we need to unpack this a tiny bit more? So clearly, I'm never satisfied just with the data, so our research unpacks it a bit more. And so one of the things that we're looking at is cooperation patterns, right? So how much these actors end up cooperating with each other and kind of looking for solutions to conflicts together, and how much do they go and try to do it by themselves. And so the graph that I'm showing you right now is from a forthcoming publication that I'm working on with two colleagues at Edinburgh, where we're comparing kind of the Permanent Five members and their cooperation patterns. And so around 10% of peace agreements where Permanent Five, so that is US, Russia, China, UK, and France, participate in, include all of them. So that's that last stack on the right. And so these are big political settlements, such as the settlements so from the 90s in Bosnia, Cambodia, but also settlements like Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Sudan. So a lot of these kind of big conferences that tend to hit the headlines tend to involve all five of them. And so in around 10% of peace settlements that involve Permanent Five members, all five of them are present. Around 8% of settlements, and that's the fifth one, include both US and Russia. And so this is the fifth column from the left. And so these are usually settlements, including some quite recent settlements in Eastern Europe. And in these cases, United States and Russia often act as security guarantors in these agreements. But what stands out in this chart, and I'm sure you're going to see it, there are two very standout columns on the left, is that about half of all agreements where we can find Permanent Five as signatories are signed either only by Russia or only by United States. So they do them by themselves. So US and Russia are generally, and this hasn't changed from sort of the 1990s that much, are just generally not team players, right? They don't tend to cooperate. They quite often sign peace agreements by themselves. And this is actually, if anything, getting worse over the last kind of decade and a half. So I'm here sharing some of the data from the United Nations Security Council vetoes, and this probably won't come as a surprise that United States and Russia are often blocking multilateral responses where they are militarily engaged. So United States, the big case is clearly Israel, and in the case of Russia, that's been for the last decade and a half Syria. And you can also see, and I'll come back to China in just a tiny bit, is that China often joins Russia in these vetoing of resolutions where Russia is actually militarily engaged, but China is not. So if they're blocking multilateral responses, but at the same time, they're some of the biggest signatories of peace agreements, what does that mean? Is essentially it means that they're going solo in areas of high interest. And here I'm sharing some of the visualization of the data. It's a more detailed overview of where Russia has signed peace agreements since 2010. And you can see sort of when Vladimir Putin returned to power. And the white dots on the screen that are highlighted are peace agreements in Syria, Libya, and the Central African Republic, where Russia was acting as a third-party guarantors. So what is interesting about these conflicts and why that internationalization of wars matters is that in all of these conflicts, Russia is actually militarily engaged. So on one hand, it's providing weapons, and on the other hand, it is engaging in peacemaking, in brokering peace agreements between the government and the rebel groups. So why is this important? Why going solo in areas of high interest is important? It's because when countries go solo in areas of high interest, and I'll give you a couple of screenshots to it, they're often asking for things in return. So it's not the kind of peacemaking that is done in the interest of kind of resolving the conflict on the ground. And so here's kind of a sampling of sort of Russian and United States asking for things in return on sort of in exchange for sort of holding a brokering role. So to me, one of the most interesting ones, and one that kind of escapes the news quite often, is the current discussion of Somaliland, which is a breakaway region from Somalia and has been kind of striving for recognition for a very long time, and is now actively engaging in talks with the US administration about offering a strategic port in exchange for recognition, right? So this would be kind of resolving a conflict between Somalia and Somaliland, where a third party would be getting something in return. So I spoke a tiny bit about Russia and United States because there are some similarities in how they are approaching kind of peacemaking. So what about China? And China is actually a very interesting and a puzzling actor for us to research. It is very much not a prolific signatory of peace agreement. So it's in the company of countries such as Kenya, Egypt, and Nigeria, so very much regional powers. It's nowhere close to Russia or United States in the number of peace agreements that it signs. And in the last 35 years, for example, even countries such as Norway signed twice as many peace agreements as China, which is kind of a tiny bit puzzling given the importance of China as providing security guarantees in a lot of these transitions from war to peace. The other thing that is interesting, at least in sort of our data, is that China seems to be a supporter of multilateral peacemaking. And so our longitudinal data, and this is that blue dot on the right, kind of shows that China mostly signs peace agreements where all permanent five are present or United Nations is present. So it's very much part of these cooperative peace agreements, big peace conferences that it wants to be guaranteeing sort of as a signatory. But I do think, and this is what kind of going into the cases helps us a tiny bit, is that we need to take this data with a pinch of salt, especially because China's role is changing incredibly quickly. And we've actually seen sort of changes over the last kind of 3 to 5 years, which is clearly not enough to capture in longitudinal data. So China has been, over the last couple of years, actively engaging in peacemaking and in some slightly unusual ways. So the conflict that you probably might have heard of, or sort of the peace agreement that you might have heard of, is the one between Saudi Arabia and Iran, where China emerged as a mediator and a security guarantor after regional powers, Iraq and Oman, did most of the groundwork. China actually came in and signed this peace agreement as a third-party witness. The other one that I think is incredibly interesting is that in the current conflict between Israel and Palestine, or Israel and Hamas, China is actually mediating between Palestinian factions, in particularly between Hamas and Fatah, and it's getting involved in sort of increasingly interesting ways there. But it's also incredibly involved in mediating conflicts in areas where it has some strategic interest. So South Sudan has been welcoming China's increasing role, and particularly some of our other colleagues in the consortium and working on China's role in Myanmar. So in addition to sort of increasing unilateralism or sort of going outside of the UN system that we've seen by China in the last couple of years, we're also seeing in parallel weakening of Western efforts in some of the existing peace settlements. And so here is kind of data from a project I've been working on with one of our researchers, Kasia Houghton, looking at a very long-lasting peace settlements in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where China was for years years a very strong supporter of the state building project there, and then sort of over the last couple of years started objecting to the efforts. So we're clearly witnessing an interesting dynamic by all three, and kind of switches towards more unilateral and transactional approaches, which makes the coordination between these three very complicated. And that's just the three of them. And so what I wanted to do in sort of the remainder of my intervention, and just to kind of give you sort of a bit of a bigger perspective, is I wanted to open my comments a bit and look at how peacemaking today looks beyond the big powers. Because we cannot look at intervention of these three in isolation from the intervention of other powers. And so this is incredibly important, and I wanted to kind of highlight some of the trends that we've been seeing over the last sort of decade or so that are incredibly important to understand contemporary peacemaking space. And these are the kind of the debates that don't necessarily enter the headlines, news headlines that we're seeing, but are kind of complicating peacemaking today. We are seeing an increasing regionalization of efforts. So quite often neighboring states get heavily involved in peacemaking. We're also seeing what some have described as new actors, actors such as Turkey, Gulf states getting more and more involved in mediation and brokering peace agreement. So I wouldn't say that these are new actors, but they are increasingly important actors. But at the same time, we're still seeing these traditional peacemakers, such as United Nations or regional organizations or small liberal powers like Norway or Switzerland. They're still trying to kind of mediate and broker peace agreements. But we are also seeing their role increasingly diminishing in a competitive peace marketplace. And so what I wanted to do is share a couple of examples, and I'm happy to unpack all of them and talk to you at length over some of the data that we're seeing. But I wanted to kind of highlight two cases and sort of how they show this diversification and congestion of different mediators. So the first case is looking at sort of Sudan from 2018 on. The latest data that we have is until December 2024. And so here we're following sort of how mediation landscape has been evolving since the ouster of Omar al-Bashir and kind of the eruption of civil war. And what is interesting is, and so that's the top graph that I'm showing you, is that in particular months, we have over 30 actors trying to mediate the conflict, which is clearly a very congested space and making it very difficult to coordinate these efforts. But what this data is also showing is that we're also seeing an increasing diversity of actors. So on the one hand, we have these traditional actors such as the African Union or the regional states such as South Sudan, Ethiopia coming into play, but we're also seeing kind of new players such as Saudi Arabia coming in. And so Sudan has been a very interesting example of mediation developments and sort of this multi-mediation, because we've actually had establishment of parallel mediation tracks, which started undermining each other. We've also seen very interesting combinations of United States partnering with Saudi Arabia in order to push forward mediation, which 20 years ago, when we were kind of intervening in the conflict in Sudan, United States was partnering with the United Kingdom and Norway. So we're kind of seeing very much kind of interesting constellations, new actors emerging, and very much complicating each other's efforts. The other conflict, which I think is on everybody's mind these days, that we're also kind of looking at, and we're tracking it from 23 on, is Israel and Palestine, where we're kind of looking at also at a broader conflict complex. And I just wanted to kind of show two visualizations here, which I think are very striking. So the first is the heat map, which kind of shows where mediation took place. And so clearly, the biggest hotspots are where we have kind of the main mediators, so Qatar, Egypt, and United States. But you can also see that we have mediation in Moscow, in Beijing, a lot of locations in Europe, and in some in Africa and beyond. And so I think it's interesting to kind of look at the diversity of mediators that are taking kind of trying to sort of direct the peace process there. So US, Egypt, Qatar, clearly the top mediators in that conflicts. But it's also interesting. And so, for example, France enters as one of the top mediators as well, because France gets actively involved with the United States in mediation with Lebanon over the Hezbollah. To it, but it's also, as I mentioned before, China, which is not participating at all in that top tier of mediation, is kind of trying to mediate between factions, Palestinian factions themselves. So this is clearly just a bit of a taster of showing you sort of some of the things that are happening, and sort of how sort of peacemaking is changing, and what kind of issues it's kind of popping up. And so I wanted to just kind of briefly conclude on some of the impacts and sort of what we're seeing in our research, and then open up for questions. So the first thing that I wanted to highlight is that we're seeing far less written agreements. There's much more kind of deal-making announcements of ceasefires, including the one that we had last night, just on social media. So one of the things that we've been kind of looking at, so, and again, I threw up the Sudan data on the screen is, so the blue dots here on the screen are the legal agreements that the parties have agreed to, that have entered into that sort of peace agreement data set, where we can actually look at sort of what are the provisions, is there any monitoring, who are the parties, and sort of who are the guarantors. And so clearly in the conflicts such as Sudan, the red dots, which are just kind of smaller agreements, sort of ceasefires, hostage releases, are dominating the agenda. So we have far less written agreements that we can sink our teeth into. The other thing that we are seeing because of this sort of congestion and coordination problems, we have agreements that have very limited scope. So most of the agreements that we're seeing in contemporary conflicts focus on ceasefires, opening of trade routes. So the grain deal in Ukraine would, for example, be an example of that. Hostage exchanges, facilitation of humanitarian aid. So kind of very basic agreements that never kind of move parties towards discussion of how a political arrangement or transition from conflict, war to peace might look like. The other thing that we're also seeing is we're increasingly seeing agreements just between armed actors. So very exclusive agreements that don't include civilians in their consideration. We're also seeing far less detailed agreements that don't have monitoring, which is a traditional role of international organizations. And so what I wanted to conclude on, and which I think is going to open quite a lot of interesting questions and gives us a lot of things to think about sort of as a research group as well, is clearly peacemaking today is continuing. We're not in a situation where actors are not trying to move from war to peace. We're still seeing peace agreements, we're still seeing ceasefires, we're still seeing hostage releases, despite the fact that the situation looks quite dire in the news. But what we are seeing is the decline of a process, and a process is exceptionally important. It is what moves us from those little piecemeal arrangements, a ceasefire, a hostage release, a prisoner exchange, to sort of settlements when we're discussing actual agreement of sort of what a future of peace might look like. And so one of the dire things that is coming out of our data is that over the last 3 years, we haven't seen, and this is the only 3-year period that we have seen so far from the 1990s, we haven't seen a single comprehensive peace agreement being signed. The second thing that we are also seeing, and I think this is probably coming out of my talk quite clearly, is we're seeing this emergence of multi-mediation. We're seeing multiple overlapping mediation processes directed towards very discrete problems and actors that make up sort of a broader complex conflict system. So the example that I spoke to you about before, the conflict system around Israel, is clearly an example of that. We have one particular set of actors negotiating between Hamas and Israel. We have another set of actors negotiating the intra-Palestinian. We have a third set of actors negotiating Israel, Lebanon, Hezbollah, and now a fourth set of actors. They overlap a tiny bit, negotiating between Israel and Iran. And so while multi-mediation by itself is not problematic, what we are kind of struggling with and what we are kind of trying to think through in this project, and where we are working with policymakers in the UK, but also beyond, is trying to think through whether this multi-mediation can be managed, directed, and how deliberate can it be? Is it a division of powers, responsibilities, and can it become more than a sum of its parts? At the moment, we haven't seen sort of that happen, but there are kind of big questions that sort of norm-concerned actors that are interested in transitions from war to peace are struggling with. And so I think that's where I'm going to end my intervention, because this is such a contemporary topic that I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. I've also shared our website for the project, Peace Hub, and I know Hannah is sharing the details in the chat as well. Thank you for this. Craig, to you.
Thanks, Mateja. Thanks for a really fantastic talk. It's always great to get these kind of insights into the research and passions of our academics here at St Andrews. We've already had a load of questions in, but if you do have a question, please do get it into the chat box on your screen, and we'll ask as many of them as we can between now and 6:15. So I was just going to start off with your research shows that there's clear differences between the way that Russia and China approach mediation and agreement. Could you expand a bit on the differences between the two countries? Because they're quite often seen as allies and kind of similar actors, but there's obviously clear differences in the way that they're approaching these kind of mediations.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is a very important question, because quite often we kind of almost say China and Russia as if it's one actor, right? And they do sometimes do things in tandem. And so I think voting in the Security Council, which I highlighted on Syria, to me was an interesting thing. Or I was mentioning also sort of how China is now sort of increasingly pairing with Russia in sort of conflicts where it has like slightly less interest, sort of Bosnian peace settlement, not really a high priority for China. And so it's clearly about building alliances. But I think it's important to understand that China and Russia have very different positions in the global order, and that this seriously impacts their sort of approaches to conflicts, peace agreements, peace settlements, mediation. So China is a major economic power, right? So it's a major global economic power. And so its interest is primarily in stability. It wants to expand markets. It wants to secure raw materials. It is interested in kind of stabilizing conflicts. And so because of that, a lot of the activity that China does is through not military matters, but economic sort of cooperation. It's also heavily focusing on governments, because it knows that by focusing on governments, it can ensure access to conflicts. And it also is aware that stability often requires multilateral approaches. On the other hand, and I think this is important to remember, is that Russia is a relatively small economy, but according to most rankings is a second most powerful military. And so that kind of shapes its own approach. So it's very much, so I would say Russia is primarily focused on its neighborhood, very much former Soviet Union Eastern Europe. It very heavily engages there and exerts kind of this mixture between military engagement and sort of at the same time trying to broker agreements. The Nagorno-Karabakh sort of agreement was a good example of that recently between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But it also kind of is now starting to militarily engage a bit further away, sort of such as Syria, or through Wagner Group in so Africa Corps now in African states. But those are all self-financing operations, right? They're kind of there are kind of different approaches because they do hold very different positions in global order. So I always say we often get asked sort of how non-Western powers or illiberal powers are engaging in peacemaking. And I always kind of say that we need to differentiate between them the same way as we would differentiate between Norway and the United States.
Thanks. That's really interesting. And speaking of global powers, I'm going to ask you a question about the thing that quite a lot of people have been asking about. And I know it kind of takes time for academic research to look into how agreements are crafted and how things actually carry on in the real world. But I wondered if you could give some initial thoughts on the ceasefire that happened this morning, or maybe didn't happen this morning. I've not looked at the news in the last few hours, so I'm not sure what's happening there. But it's a very kind of fresh agreement. And I was just wondering how this kind of situation fits in or doesn't fit in to the trends that you see in your research. And I mean, would you even say that it counts as an agreement, given that it's not written down, it's very fragile? Yeah, if you could comment a bit on that. I think that there's been a few questions on that, and a lot of folk would be keen to hear about it.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting thing, and I kind of knew that I'm going to be writing the comments on this until the last minute, probably. So the agreement or non-agreement, however you want to call it, that Trump administration has brokered between Iran and Israel, the ceasefire that we're looking at, and then the fact that it was immediately almost kind of broken. So I think I have a couple of thoughts on this, and I think our research is kind of highlighting, it does link to our research. So one thing that I would say is kind of this discussion that we're now having about ceasefire being broken or not broken, that is being bantered between Israel and Iran, is I think it's important to know that ceasefires are often broken. Most, so I don't think I would struggle to find really good data on that, but I would say most ceasefires end up being broken and get renegotiated and renewed, things like that. So that's not unusual because we have a lack of trust between parties. There's often also very poor communication between parties, so we kind of don't know. There's signaling going back and forth. And parties also sometimes just strike ceasefires because it allows them to regroup. So probably that's not the case in Israel and Iran, given how weakened Iran is at the moment. But in the case of Sudan, which is one of the conflicts that we're looking at, like we've had so many ceasefires that were immediately broken or lasted for a couple of days, which just allowed parties to regroup. The other thing that is also interesting for me with this is that, and it's an interesting type of a ceasefire, and it speaks to the need for the data set that we're actually doing. So most data sets and most research is tracking ceasefires that are kind of legal agreements, which this wouldn't be, right? So it was something that was quickly announced. Nobody has signed this. It was announced on social media, but it's actually indicating how peacemaking is changing today. And this is not just sort of the new Trump administration approaches. A lot of the peace agreements or ceasefires are now just kind of announced. It's a handshake deal without an agreement. But there was clearly a communication going on. There's clearly some mediation, signaling going on between US and Israel and Iran, and both Israel and Iran agreed to it publicly. So speaking of this would be the newest agreement in our MEND data set, in our mediation data set, but it wouldn't be in the other legal data set. But it also raises very important questions about the mediator. And I think this kind of, again, brings us back to that transactional peacemaking. Because in this case, the United States would be a third party. It was mediating, but it's clearly not impartial right? This is not Switzerland or Norway or United Nations trying to broker an agreement. Is it even a third party, given that it bombed Iran 2 days ago? But it clearly wants to act as a guarantor. And if you've been following kind of communication today, it's sending clear signals to both parties, Israel, in this case in particular, about kind of stepping down, pulling down the weapons. So it wants the ceasefire to succeed. That doesn't mean that it is going to succeed, but clearly United States is positioning itself as a guarantor of peace. But it does raise a number of questions, what impact this might have. Is it durable? How it impacts broader negotiations and things like that, which are, and those are still the things that we will be looking at over the next days, months, possibly years.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And speaking about kind of leading on from that, we have an anonymous question from someone who's said, do you believe that your research could have an important impact on the prevention of war? And I guess that's a question about impact in terms of where is your research being disseminated and used in these kind of looking at these data sets. Is that leading the way that people act? And how might you be able to do that through your research?
I think it's important. So we tend to think of, so as I mentioned initially, I kind of think of war to peace transition, but the reality is like peace is very fragile, and quite often, I'm sorry I didn't pop up any of this, but quite often sort of even peace agreements go up and down and up and down, and sort of like we kind of have recurrence of sort of war. And I think one of the things that we're now trying to, and we're actively engaging sort of the Foreign Office around this question, is particularly sort of how to work in absence of kind of clear processes where you would have building blocks that eventually lead to some kind of an agreement. You get more actors involved. How do you kind of rethink this multi-mediation space? Where can you act without sort of negative unintended consequences? So how do you create opportunities for actors beyond those carrying weapons to come to? And so I think the biggest potential, and I think this is where research on sort of peacemaking is going to be looking at over the next 10 years or so, decade, is definitely how in an era where kind of clear peace processes are becoming rarer and rarer, how can we live with these multi-mediation track? And I think there are opportunities on particular conflicts to engage policymakers as well with the data that we have.
Thank you. Emmanuel has written in to ask, he says that his belief was that Russia was in conflict with Ukraine, yet you frequently mentioned that Russia is a peacemaker in a lot of places. So where does the truth lie? Is Trump a peacemaker and is Putin a warmonger, or is it not as simple as that? There's obviously a lot of interesting dualities going on in the way that states are acting. And is there anything in the data that's interesting to pull out about that?
Yeah, so this is such a great question. It's a question that's been dominating us, and quite often when we're looking at particular conflicts, trying to decide who's the third party here, we're kind of having very big discussions over, is it a third party, is it not a third party? But I think so one of the things that I would say is I think we need to know that no mediator in any conflict is entirely impartial. So even when I say United Nations or Norway or Switzerland, the good guys, the way that we tend to think about them, they're not entirely impartial. So Norway does sort of mediation and peacemaking also to increase its own profile on the global stage. So it's not entirely an altruistic actor in that way. But what I think it's important to understand, and I think we're now conducting a lot of the research on this, it's exactly this intersection of highly partial mediators. And so I think, so one of the things that I'm now doing in one of my researchers, and we're kind of crunching the numbers, is particularly looking at the rise of actors that are supporting militarily a particular actor in a conflict, so providing weapons, providing boots on the ground, and how that, and they are then getting involved in the peacemaking themselves. And so the example of Russia, right? So there's a lot of research done on Russia, and we tend to see Russia as a war maker. There's a lot of research done on Russia providing weapons and then getting involved in peacemaking. But there's also other actors that are doing very similar things. So I think the line between sort of a war maker and a peacemaker is becoming very, very fuzzy. But I do think that the data sets that we're kind of looking can bust some of the myths about certain actors being always in a bad basket and other actors always being in a good basket.
Okay. Also related to that, another anonymous question has come in to say, of the peace settlements that are signed, is there a difference between how many of the peace agreements are actually upheld depending on which of the major powers have signed them? I don't know if that's something you're aware of in your data. And someone's also asked a question around in a world where the UN is of arguably less significance on a global scale, are peacekeeping missions still a thing that are effective in upholding peace agreements?
Yeah, so I think the two questions are actually quite linked, and sort of the durability of peace. This is not something. So I would have to crack the numbers on sort of how this is changing more recently. But generally, we have really, really good data then when there is monitoring. So these tend to be sort of these big settlements with multi-party that involve the United Nations, including peacekeepers. Quite often, there's less of a recurrence of a war. So peacekeeping, for example, despite the fact that, and I am one of those people that like constantly flags up issues with peacekeeping and problems, is actually a really good, correlates quite well to the durability of settlements. So just as a very quick kind of and then not very kind of detailed overview, we do have research that shows that kind of peace agreements that are supported by multiple kind of external guarantors that are supported by United Nations do tend to last a tiny bit longer. But that doesn't mean that wars don't erupt after these agreements either.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to do a handbrake turn into an area that is quite different, and maybe outside of your research at the moment, but it's a question that's asked on almost every one of these, no matter what it's about. It's do you see any sort of role for AI in guiding traditional political government actors towards transactional peace agreements? Or is that even something that you use in your data collection or crunching? Because obviously it's a huge issue at the moment, and everybody across the university is contending with AI and how it's going to change things that we do for the better or for just to make things different. So yeah, if there's any sort of AI link to this,
I can definitely take that on. I'll try to do both a tiny bit. So in terms of our own research, we're currently kind of putting together ideas for the next stage, and we've been piloting some of the large language model tools on this mediation data set. It is becoming increasingly important for us, primarily because the way we are constructing this data set, just to give you a bit of an insight in why we need AI, is we're kind of relying both on sort of traditional sources where we can find instances of mediation. So that might be sort of UN reports, international organization reports that have, basically that provide details of it. But we're also relying on news reporting and sort of web scraping. Mm-hmm. And so because one of the primary things that we wanted to do is kind of go against some of the biases in reporting that happens in Western media, we now need to go to web scrapes, which then ends up meaning that we, so for Sudan that I was showing on, we pull a lot of sources from Ethiopia, Kenya, that kind of then report on what activities those countries are engaging in. But you can imagine how many news articles we hit when we get to Israel or Ukraine. And so in order to kind of get through that data and filter that data, we're now kind of using large language models to help us extract big kind of events that we're then trying to put in the database. So it's definitely the next step in our research, and it's something that I am super excited to work with some of the computer science students at St. Andrews as well. It is not my field. I'm very much an international relations scholar, so sometimes it's also a bit of translation problem, but I'm very excited because I can see the potential for the data sets to grow and grow much more quickly.
Yeah.
In terms of the other actors, I am willing to bet that they do, right? Is that AI is very much used in governments at the moment. And one of the things that we are trying to do in sort of the PeaceRub consortium is to kind of ensure that the data on peace side of things, so on mediation, on agreements, is just as robust as the data on the war side of things. Because we know that sort of artificial intelligence and sort of data approaches are going to be used for war tech. But what we want to do is ensure that it's also used in sort of mediation initiatives. So we're working quite a lot. And so the Edinburgh team has been very much pioneering on that, doing sort of dashboards and sort of things like that allow policymakers also to extract things on the peace side of things.
Great, thank you. That was a really fulsome answer. So I think time's gone really quickly. So I think we've only got time for one more question. So I'm going to bring it right back to home in the UK. I want to ask what rethinking do liberal actors need to undertake to remain or to kind of regain their relevance in peacemaking? And where does that leave the UK and its role in the world?
So I think there's a couple of things that sort of liberal actors or actors that care about sort of collaborative approaches need to do is, one, I think it's very important to start engaging with conflict complexes, right? It's not just about mediation between, again, I'm going to bring it back to Israel and Hamas, right? It's about how do you ensure that, the Palestinian Authority, so Fatah movement, is involved. How do you ensure that you take account of what's going on in Lebanon, in Israel, so that the entire conflict complex is engaged as a whole? The other thing that I think our research is showing very clearly is that we need to engage with actors which traditionally we wouldn't be working with as much in sort of peacemaking efforts, including China, including Gulf states in a lot of conflicts, because they might be the ones that can lead particular moments. I will say that in terms of the UK, and I've been thinking about this a lot, especially also because some of the funding that we receive is coming from the UK Foreign Office. Mm-hmm. I think UK is actually in a very unique position, and it's actually in a very good position to unlock a lot of things. It is one of the actors that gets invited to these ad hoc arrangements on sort of how do we broker a conflict in Sudan, how do we broker a conflict in Israel, and things like that. So it's very much part of that small group of kind of little groups of friends that are trying to broker things on an ad hoc basis. But at the same time, UK also has very much an interest in preserving the United Nations, given that it has a privileged role. And so one of the roles that I can see for the United Kingdom in this new landscape is in trying to ensure that sort of these ad hoc arrangements, which tend to kind of focus on very immediate issues, are then able to be translated into a process where the United Nations is involved. And so I do see United Kingdom being in a very unique position in terms of that.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one more quick question, just because it's piqued my interest, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but Alison Baverstock has asked, to whom should you give the next Nobel Peace Prize?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one. Can I do a politically correct answer and say, let's see how the current ceasefire evolves?
Okay, that's very astute of you. That's well handled. Anyway, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and we're really, really grateful to have your expertise for the evening. So it just falls to me to thank Mateja again for a thoroughly interesting talk. It's really great to get these insights into the research and the passions of our academics. thanks for taking the time to talk to us on a subject which you're clearly passionate about and world leading in. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks also to all the staff who've given their time to make arrangements for this event. There's a lot of work that goes into these, and it's much appreciated by all of us. Finally, a big thank you to all of our esteemed alumni and students and staff and friends for attending the talk. We're delighted to be able to welcome you virtually back to St Andrews every few weeks. So do please continue to attend these events, watch the old ones on YouTube, and as I said, keep your eyes peeled for the next Saints talk in the new academic year. So that will be sometime in September. We look forward to seeing you then, but for now, thanks very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your evening.